Recently, Benny Johnson, podcaster, talked about this subject once again. 911, what really happened? Well, 我告诉你，其实我对这一方面也有很久以前谈过，因为当时我也是做这个时事评论，我只能告诉大家，就是说，不是好像大部分人以为，就是因为飞机的缘故，所以这个911 Twin Tower 就掉下来，差不多可以说没有可能的。I've done a lot of research myself personally. Way back, that's 20-some years ago. I don't recall and remember all the details, but I concur with what Benny Johnson and Tucker Carlson in this podcast, and I will try to summarize it in Mandarin as well. But after you watch the next 4 or 5 minutes, I believe you will start raise a lot of legitimate questions. Did the plane brought down the Twin Tower, or was it more than that? What was behind it? And also, there are 2 or 3 very much unanswered questions. Strange things that happen. Now, 请听一听. Please listen very carefully. So this is the podcast here, and I want to start and share with you the highlights of what they are saying here.
And if there's somebody who has questioned the official narrative of September 11th, it would be our president of the United States, Donald Trump, who on the morning of September 11th went on live TV and said this: the towers couldn't fall without a bomb being placed in them.
Donald, you're probably the best-known builder, particularly of great buildings in the city. There's a great deal of question about whether or not the damage and the ultimate destruction of the buildings was caused by the airplanes, by architectural defect, or possibly by bombs or aftershocks. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it was an architectural defect. You know, the World Trade Center was always known as a very, very strong building. Don't forget, that took a big bomb in the basement.
Now, this is something new to a lot of people. But 以前我们的川普总统 you know, 他911之后，当时他还没有做总统 OK? 他说没有可能，这个 plane brought the buildings down. 他说有爆炸，有 explosion， 这也是我的结论。This is also my, conclusion, and it was way back 20-some years ago. That was my personal belief based upon my personal research. 好，再听听Trump 当时怎么样说。The next day after 9/11， 就是说 September 12th， 这是川普 back then as a businessman, also as a builder, very familiar with structural engineering and architect, 他说
Now, the basement is the most vulnerable place because that's your foundation. And it withstood that. And I got to see that area about 3 or 4 days after it took place because one of my structural engineers actually took me for a tour because he did the building. And I said, I can't believe it. The building was standing solid and half of the columns were blown out. I mean, so this was an unbelievably powerful building. If you know anything about structure, it was one of the first buildings that was built from the outside. The steel.
川普说这一个 Twin Tower 是 back then 可以说是最强、最 strong、最 enduring 的 building， 所以他was shocked， 他也去几天之后去看过当时这个情况，带他的 structural engineering。In fact， 他的 structural engineering 就是 the one who built 这个911 Tower， 他同他一起去 observe， 他说没有可能。Not because of 这个 heat， 这个热到 is not going to melt the steel. 那还有很多证据哈，听一听。
The reason the World Trade Center had such narrow windows is that in between all the windows you had the steel on the outside. So you had the steel on the outside of the building. That's why when I first looked, and you had big, heavy I-beams. When I first looked at it, I couldn't believe it because there was a hole in the steel. And this is steel that was, you remember the width of the windows in the World Trade Center, folks. I think if you were ever up there, they were quite narrow. And in between was this heavy steel. I said, how could a plane, even a 767 or 747 or whatever it might have been, how could it possibly go through the steel? I happen to think that they had not only a plane, but they had bombs that exploded almost simultaneously, because I just can't imagine anything being able to go through that wall. 所以他说同一个时间飞机碰到这个 building 的时间
应该有爆炸，有 explosion. Now listen to 很多 eyewitnesses. 我看应该你大部分人 90% you have never heard the following. Listen to the firemen. Listen to the witnesses back then. Immediately, now back then I read also a paper called The Spotlight. 很多人没有听过. So even way back then, I look at the theory, I look at the science and the engineering and what the experts are saying, and they said, wow, that is impossible. 所以我当时已经相信在这个 building 下面 in the basement or the ground floor 有爆炸引起 simultaneously 这个 building 才能够 the way it fall down also the way it collapsed had to be an explosion.
Then you'll go and listen to the firefighters, the people who are in the buildings themselves, and you'll give the respect to the people who most likely suffered greatly, died of cancer, carcinomas, and so on, that happened to all of these people that inhaled everything after these buildings collapsed. You'll listen to them.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
这些救火人 firemen 说我们听到爆炸的声音
Was that a secondary explosion? Yes, it was.
有第二个爆炸 not the 飞机另外一个
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom, it was like a bomb went off, and another explosion came right on.
See, another explosion. 你听见吗？你说为什么 back then in 911 or 24 years ago 我们当时看这个 TV Channel 75 CBS whatever 为什么没有一个人报道 Actually, it was wrong. 我告诉你 Right after 911 这个飞机的事件发生 Immediately, there were already quite a few reports that the media say there was another explosion. But soon afterwards, that story disappeared as if 有人告诉他 Don't say that. Don't say that. You're not allowed to say that. 所以完全这个 story 改变信不信由你 That story changed so quickly. Soon after witness said, I heard explosion. Then the story changed. Sounds familiar? Someone was doing something to influence the media.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building.
Even the media, back then, they're quoting the original media.
They do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
有爆炸的 device, 有炸弹
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
There are so many more. This goes on, okay? So story after story. Now here is the evidence, okay? So let me ask you, there are some unanswered questions, okay? 为什么 the day before 这个 911 building 里面有一个政府的部门，我不方便讲啊。这个if my memory serves me correctly， 这个 building 里面有一个 tenant， 好像是政府某一个部门 department， 告诉所有的员工明天千万不要上班。Why？ 不是假期 not a holiday. Why? They got heads up. Someone knew. Also, 你有没有听过就是说这个关于这个911里面有一个公司 I think it's a brokerage firm. Start with an M. But anyway, I'm trying to remember because 太久以前很多人都将这个股票卖了 Sold, I think there was massive dumping of a certain stock the day or a few days before 911 as if someone knew that something's going to happen and they got out. 总之有很多不同的 indications, all the 矛头指角 someone knew. Now, 为什么 why did they have 911? Whoever is the mastermind behind it, what were they trying to accomplish? I'll tell you why. They were trying to lure and provoke 美国 America to attack Iraq. Who could be the mastermind? 我越研究时间，我就越chills up my spine. 我最好对别人说 If I say it, some conservatives will be upset. They said can't be. Well, that's because they're a bit naive, okay? Yeah. Whoever is behind it, I tell you what, it may shake your faith. It may say, no way. Well, sad to say. This may be one of the few remaining documents. If you try to search today in YouTube or whatever and in online, hard to find those quotes because many of them got deleted. They were gone, pulled down. So this one, undisputed facts about controlled demolition, 就是有人maybe remotely demolish 让这个 building collapse. Okay? Now, 这些人我告诉都是专家。好多都是专家 licensed architect 里面有很多人都是有230个 architect 你看见吗 engineer 工程师很多是专门研究这些他们都说曾经有100个 high rise 很高的 building 都有火灾没有一个跌倒没有一个 collapse not one collapse except this one and you say well it was high heat But high heat itself, do you know how high it has to be? It has to be, I think, if I remember correctly, 1,340 degree F. But then the temperature that reached at that time was probably from the plane, about 600 to 800 Fahrenheit. But it's a lot more than this, okay? It's a lot more than this. So anyway, I don't have time to go through all this, but it is fascinating. Keep your minds open and do some independent research. 好，谢谢你的时间。Sometimes it's more than what meets the eyes. Well, it may appear to be something, but behind the scene, something else. There's people pulling string, there are people behind the scene doing things. You say, you're a conspiracy nut. Well, I'm not a conspiracy nut. But do you realize 最近几年很多所谓阴谋论 turn out to be factual. 最近几年的所谓好多个阴谋论关于这个拜登关于拜登的健康很多很多事情 turn out to be 事实不是阴谋论我讲的对不对好谢谢